Hi, friends. Talk of impeachment fills the air, so let's talk about it. Firstly, impeachment is a constitutionally defined process. The Constitution says the House has sole power of impeachment, meaning no other body can bring impeachment charges. Then it says the Senate has the sole responsibility for trial of any impeachments, and when holding such a trial, the Senate must be on oath. It further says that if the president is being impeached, then the Chief Justice presides over the Senate. Normally, the vice president is the president of the Senate and would preside over most activities, but in an impeachment trial that could result in that vice president becoming president, they cannot preside. So, all of that is part of the system of checks and balances. Impeachment is the process by which the House brings formal charges against a federal officer, but they can't try the person for those charges. Only the Senate can. Likewise, the Senate cannot bring charges and therefore cannot convict someone without them first being impeached by the House. Similarly, by mandating that the vice president be recused in a trial of the president, it theoretically removes that potential bias of an ambitious vice president seeking removal of the president so that they can have the job. Now, keep in mind that all of the things that are being prevented by a design like this are things that the learned and educated framers of the Constitution knew had occurred in various Western governments, dating back to ancient Greece and all through time on up to their time. Next, the Constitution says that the Senate needs a 2/3 concurrence of the members present to convict. Then it says that the punishment or judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than removal from office and disqualification from holding any office under the United States. In other words, the duly elected representatives of the legislative branch can decide who is fit to hold office under the Constitution, but at no point do they become a criminal trial. The Constitution does, however, go on to say that a party convicted in an impeachment trial can also be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, punishment according to the law. So this is a rare case where double jeopardy can occur. A president, for example, can be convicted in an impeachment trial and then separately tried criminally by the judiciary. The next thing that the Constitution says about impeachment has to do with the president's pardon powers. It says that cases of impeachment are an exception to those powers. So the president has far-reaching powers of pardon, but cannot pardon those convicted in an impeachment trial. The Constitution goes on after that to say that the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, how to define high crimes and misdemeanors becomes a murky subject very quickly. And the last thing that the Constitution says about impeachment is that this is an exception to the jury trial guarantee. In other words, criminal proceedings are guaranteed a trial by jury, with the exception of this impeachment process. However, remember that an official can be removed from office and barred from holding any office through conviction in an impeachment trial, but then also be tried by a jury in a criminal trial for the same crimes. Okay, now for the numbers. The House has initiated impeachment proceedings 60 times. 21 of those resulted in impeachment. 8 of those resulted in conviction by the Senate. All 8 were federal judges. Of the 13 impeached but not convicted people, 3 were presidents, 1 was a senator, and 1 was a cabinet secretary. The rest were federal judges. One possible addendum to all that is that President Nixon would almost certainly have been impeached and very likely convicted, but he resigned before the House could act. Now let's focus on the presidents. President Johnson was impeached in 1868 on 11 articles of impeachment. They all dealt with 2 things. One, he had dismissed the Secretary of War, who had been duly appointed and approved by the Congress, and many of the articles dealt with conspiracy in that action. The specific crime was a violation of the Tenure of Office Act in like 9 different ways. 2, he was charged with attempting to, quote, bring into disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach the Congress of the United States, end quote. No specific law was cited in that charge, but the implication being that it is a high crime or misdemeanor for the president to attempt to turn the people against their own Congress. Next, President Clinton was impeached in 1998 on 2 articles, one of perjury and one of obstruction of justice. These were based on allegations that he had lied under oath during the investigation into his sexual scandal with a White House intern. Next, President Trump was impeached in 2019 on 2 articles and in 2021 on 1 charge. The first impeachment articles were for abuse of power and obstructing Congress. The abuse of power was for his attempted manipulation of a foreign government into investigating his political rivals in an attempt to besmirch their candidacy. The obstruction charge was for directing defiance of subpoenas and ordering his officials to refuse to testify to Congress. The second impeachment was for inciting insurrection on 6 January 2021. As for the things that an official can be impeached for, like mentioned earlier, treason and bribery are specifically listed, and then, quote, other high crimes and misdemeanors, which is undefined in the Constitution, but typically it refers to abuses of power and violations of the public trust. But the difference in process between impeachment and criminal trial alters the burden of proof. To put that like another way, for impeachment, a simple majority of the House needs to be convinced, which would be deemed a preponderance of the evidence in legal terms. And then a supermajority of 2/3 of the Senate must be convinced to convict, which is still not the legal standard of beyond the shadow of a doubt. On the other hand, the whole impeachment and trial process has proven to be enormously political. In other words, decisions in these matters have not always been based on the evidence, but on political alignments. Like, meaning when it has been politically convenient for the predominant party to acquit, they have. I suppose it might be a positive to point out that those 8 federal judges that were convicted were all pretty much guilty as sin. So at least we haven't seen impeachment conviction wielded as a tool against political rivals. But how many times have we seen acquittal of a clearly guilty person used as a tool of political expedience? For example, I would argue that all 3 presidents that have been impeached deserved conviction. The evidence against Johnson was pretty clear that he did indeed conspire against Congress and to break a law. Clinton perhaps never really should have been on trial for his sexual escapades, but once he lied under oath, he violated the sanctity of the rule of law and should have been ousted on those grounds alone. As for Trump, he used the power of his office in an attempt to coerce a foreign nation into attacking political rivals. That's not how American politics is meant to work, nor an appropriate use of the people's power that is entrusted to the presidency. Further, anyone that denies the events of Jan 6 were an insurrection, or that Trump gave aid and comfort to those treasonous traitors, is just nutty. Not to mention the fact that the Senate didn't hold the trial for that until after Trump was already gone from office. So, what would the harm have been in those Republican senators convicting? It might have restored some serious faith in the GOP for them to uphold true American values and principles in that way. At any rate, moving forward, there are myriad things done by the current administration in its first 100 days alone that could easily be considered high crimes and misdemeanors that abuse the power of the office and violate the people's trust. Will impeachment proceedings happen, though? I'm sure more than once. Will the House impeach? Seems unlikely. Will conviction happen if the House does impeach? seems less likely still, which I think all stems from the United States government having lost its way. See, the actual power to govern is supposed to reside in the legislative branch, and the presidency is meant to be but a servant of the Congress, having neither the power to make laws nor to interpret them, only to humbly execute them, hence the executive branch. But it seems like ever since World War II, we have allowed more and more power to be transferred to the presidency, culminating today in the tyrannical despotism of an authoritarian regime hell-bent on maximizing power, minimizing dissent, and benefiting an oligarchy completely devoid of any interest in the people or our rights. So impeachment at this point, we can only hope, but even if it happens, it might just be too little too late. Stay woke, Patriots.